Welcome to a one-hour Pallium Project archival podcast of a professional development event. The views presented in this session are those of our expert guests and participants from across Canada. In this podcast, Jackie Peden, an advanced practice nurse in hospice palliative care, interviews Barry Ashpole, an Ontario-based communications consultant and educator in hospice palliative care. This session is called Initiating a Dialogue with Family.
Can you tell us in what ways are families different these days?
I think we can talk a lot about generational differences, and I think we recognize those, for example, where traditional or conventional thinking clash with contemporary ideas. But I think often we see in the palliative care setting where sometimes, even within one family, expectations, beliefs, standards, even values can vary enormously. And this may be as a result of different levels of education between one generation and another. It's quite possible, for example, in one family where somebody may be a very strong supporter of one particular belief. Let's say they support abortion, where someone else in the same family may not support that at all. So this is a marked difference between families, say, in the present generation and those of a generation ago. We cannot assume going into a family that they necessarily share the same background, life experience, education, and that they may indeed have different ideas, different values.
Yeah, and it seems when you think about it nowadays with the internet and the web and all the information that people can download from that, and then that information that they bring to discussions about what they think might happen or what they think the patient should do can be challenging at times.
It's interesting that you bring that up because we see this more and more, of course, quite often once they hear, for example, about a medication that's being prescribed. They're on the internet and they quite often have more information than the physician has or the pharmacist. I think, though, that we have to be very careful in that we should not assume that information is synonymous with knowledge that people really do understand. So we have to be particularly careful and provide some guidance and hopefully some resources that will help families, particularly when they are seeking information. But you're quite correct. They will access the internet as a primary source of information. And there's excellent information to be had on the internet, but also conflicting information, wrong information. We have to be very careful and guarded about that.
Now, why is it important to involve family members when discussing care?
Well, I think there's sort of two or three things to keep in mind. I think along with the patient, when a terminal illness strikes the family, there's a sense of a loss of control, and being involved in the discussion around care is part of helping families maintain or gain a greater sense of control and involvement in kind of helping to set the agenda. And two, of course, they potentially can be an important stabilizing influence on the palliative patient, depending on family dynamics, which we'll, I think, get into a little bit later. But they can also provide a tremendous amount of support and reassurance for one another. And in the home palliative care setting, of course, family members can assume responsibility for some of the routine tasks in care. I think involving the family in a dialogue about care for the palliative patient can also help the individual members of the family and the family as a whole begin to acknowledge their own mortality, and it can perhaps subconsciously be an important step for them in their own journey, in that it may better prepare them when they have themselves to face dying and death personally. We hear very often terminal illness, or it can be a time of great suffering, it's a time of great personal growth. And I think we can help families in this way.
When should you involve family members in discussion?
As early as is appropriate in the diagnosis of a terminal illness. We're not comfortable about that word appropriate because you can read so much into that. But one of the challenges that we have in palliative care is often when the palliative care team goes in, the family has already experienced a great deal of change and upheaval and stress. We weren't necessarily there at the time that terminal illness was diagnosed. And hopefully we're there when the patient becomes palliative. So I think we can assume, and there's a lot of research to support this, that the family's been through a very stressful time. And communication is the key issue. And I think we must assume that and take responsibility for involving them in the discussion right away. While the family deserves support from the care team, it's very, very important to acknowledge that the patient is entitled to some control over who is included in any discussion about their illness and their care. And that's part of assessing this family situation and understanding something of the dynamics, whether you're talking about an open or a closed family. An open family being one where communication is relatively easy versus a closed family where communication is very difficult. But it is the patient's call in terms of who they'd like to be involved in the discussion about the more intimate aspects of illness.
Well, and I think in this day and age, it's kind of difficult sometimes with families spread out all over, especially when you have a senior whose children may be in a number of different provinces or down in the States. And often I've come across challenging situations then when sort of at the very end you have a family member come into the situation who has arrived from far away and then start not understanding what's going on and can cause lots of stress and demands. And
perhaps we can come back to that because I had that kind of covered on some of the other questions that we had discussed earlier. But you're right, it's the famous California daughter syndrome, and I think that's become kind of a term that people apply to family members who live far away and they are accustomed to visiting only at Thanksgiving, Christmas, that kind of thing. And then when terminal illness or any serious illness strikes, they're kind of parachuted into the situation. They tend to can be very disruptive. When we talk about family, I would like to sort of highlight the need around children. I guess when we talk about family members, we perhaps, without realizing, are thinking more in terms of the adult members of a family. But it's very, very important to discuss with the family how to perhaps engage the children. It's extremely important, of course, for parents to have control over how much information children have about a parent's illness. However, it is important to keep in mind to protect a son and daughter from the truth can sometimes backfire, and it can have quite serious consequences. So that's something that needs to be explored, obviously, with the family in terms of what would be appropriate. And certainly a child of 5 would require less detailed information than, say, an adolescent or 15-year-old. But sometimes it is that tendency by the family to sort of shield children from what is happening and I think that's something where the palliative care team can provide some expertise in dealing with that kind of situation.
So what are some strategies that would be most effective in engaging families in decision-making?
First and foremost, that we ensure that the palliative patient is receiving the necessary care and that his or her wishes are respected. At the same time, working to involve the family, fielding their questions, keeping them informed. A good starting point might be to initiate a dialogue about what they understand of the patient's illness, because you may not know going in what they know. They may have very little information, but it's very helpful to understand where they're coming from, where they are at that particular time, and what they know about the illness, about the medications that are being prescribed, perhaps about what the expected benefits or likely side effects might be, and some discussion around the illness and how it's likely to progress. It's a way of engaging them in the discussion and goes back to helping them to be involved in some of the decision-making and having some sense of control of what's going on. I think, too, particularly in the home palliative care setting, there's an opportunity to explain the role and the responsibility of working together, not just as a family in terms of support, but some of the practical aspects. There's a job to be done, and they have a fairly critical role to play in that. I think one of the important things, though, that is necessary is to kind of assess family dynamics, and that's an ongoing process. That's something that you're going to do with every new development, every new change, whether that be a change for the better or a change for the worse in the patient's condition. It comes back to the point you made earlier about sometimes when a family member lives some distance away and the family is only accustomed to seeing them periodically. They're what we call the parachutist. They come in like a parachutist, dropping in.
Right.
And in the family, you need to kind of also do this ongoing assessment. So you're also looking for the drill sergeant and the consultant. The drill sergeant is the person who sort of steps forward and starts, barking orders at everyone and trying to sort of take control of the situation. And then the ideal is the consultant, the person who wants to share their thoughts and ideas and gain from you your experience, your take on what's happening. The other thing, of course, as part of the strategy is you have to weigh the pros and cons of one-on-one dialogue versus family conference. This is difficult. It's always a constant fishing trip looking for the opportunities to discuss issues with. But, family conferences are very common, except that if the family itself is a closed family, then it may be difficult to engage them in discussion. And it is a discussion, it is a conversation that will continue over time. And part of what you have to do is assess who it is you're talking to, because typically you could be in, say, around a table talking to 4 or 5 family members, and there may be 2 or 3 that are conspicuously absent, conspicuous by their silence. We need to find ways to engage them somehow. And largely depending on family dynamics, there may well be someone who has steps forward as a self-appointed spokesperson, or maybe the substitute decision maker if there is, for example, advanced directives in place. And that needs to be discussed and explored. One of the important strategies, though, is to find out if there is any living will or advanced directives in place, because if there is, then there will be a substitute decision maker or a surrogate decision maker that is the one that will be the key in terms of connecting with the family and will have added responsibility in the event that some decisions have to be made about future care.
So what happens if the person doesn't have an advanced directive and somebody from the family steps forward and says they're the main caregiver, but the rest of the family doesn't seem to agree with that? How would you proceed then?
Well, this is a whole issue, and I think that's something that needs to be established very, very early in terms of what discussion there might have been about care in the future. And if the family has not identified a substitute decision maker, then it may be the palliative care provider that has to facilitate that discussion. Because as the illness progresses, and if it becomes necessary to make some very difficult decisions, they will be in permanent crisis mode. And I think one of the important things to get people to appreciate is that we're looking to provide comfort and to relieve suffering. A very large part of that is the emotional aspect particularly around decision making. And I think that's perhaps one of the first items on the agenda in talking with families is about whether or not they have in place either a living will or advanced directives or something in which someone has been appointed power of attorney for personal care. It varies from one province to another, the terminology. But if they haven't, then there needs to be even more detailed discussion about what to expect and to try to get the family to appoint somebody. It's not a discussion or a decision that can be made in one single conversation. You need to sort of find out what the family knows, what they understand about the situation, the disease, etc., and then perhaps suggest to them that maybe they need to give some thought about decision-making in the event that their father, mother, whoever is unable to make that decision. And then that may be a second conversation. It's a step-by-step building process. Because running parallel with that is the care of the patient all the time, building that confidence, that relationship and partnership with the family. So, again, depending on the dynamics of the family, this may come easily. It may be quite a challenge. We talk about good communication, and that's everything from good listening skills, theirs as well as yours. The body language is making sure that you find the right time, the right place. Quite often, discussion around patient decisions does not happen at the right time or in the right place. The image that we often see of a doctor discussing something over the telephone when really they should be doing it face-to-face, or a nurse catching a patient, a member of the family in the corridor somewhere. These are not the places to discuss these kinds of difficult and sensitive issues. I think there's a couple of other things to think about, too, is to work very, very hard at avoiding the use of jargon. In time, you begin to appreciate the family's own language, the kind of terminology that they use, the kind of metaphors they use. You also begin to understand, hopefully, the attitudes and even prejudice that might exist. And you start to sort of develop a common language. The other thing, which is so simple, is to encourage families to write down information as they get it, but also, more importantly, to write down questions as they arise, particularly between visits, either to the doctor's office or between visits by a palliative care nurse or a physician. Simple task, but one that people seem to have difficulty with. But quite often they'll think of something only moments after the care provider has left and don't remember it when they visit again. So it sounds almost so rudimentary that people are offended when you say write this down, as if you don't trust them to remember.
Right.
But there's a classic definition.
And I've heard of patients or individuals when they go to speak to the doctor, especially at the cancer center, they actually tape the sessions because there's usually so much told to them that they don't remember it all. So if you tape it, then you can come home and listen to it again.
It's an excellent idea because I think research tells us that individually or as a group, people retain only about 20 or 25% of what they're told, and they forget half of that within 3 days. Mm-hmm. So yes, recording or writing notes. It's a simple way to keep that information together. I think one of the other things too, and this is sort of an idea actually that was developed by Ira Byock in the Missoula project in the States, and that is encouraging people to write a values history. Now, I appreciate that in some situations time is of the essence, where, however, the prognosis might be, over a longer period of time, and there's more opportunity to get involved and engage with the family. There's opportunities too to sort of develop, a closer relationship and to help the family themselves deal with the situation. And one important exercise that may be appropriate, it's an interesting one even for care providers to do, is to develop a values history. The question is, why do you think the way that you think? Why do you believe this? Why do you believe that? Is this something that's inherent? Is it taught through life experience because this is how your father reacted? It helps them understand why they think the way that they do, because one of the challenges, particularly when you're dealing with conflict within a family, is getting people to respect each other, and that even within a family they have different points of view. But it can provide sometimes some very meaningful indicators in determining what the quality of life is.
So can you give me an example of what would be written?
For example, if they have, because they've seen an experience by someone else who dealt with, let's say, cancer or AIDS, and it was an excruciating experience, it may have formed their opinions about the value of certain medications. So their opinions about, let's say, the use of opioid analgesics may be based on the fact that a friend or a family member or something they read in a newspaper suggests, that the morphine hastens death or etc. So sometimes understanding where they're coming from about certain things, so that hopefully we can, correct any misperceptions that they may have or validate them and support them. So it can be, can be quite a useful exercise for them to go through. It also gets at some other issues, for example, about what faith or belief system they may have. And it's part of, I think, quite an intimate discussion that develops in time, patient or family, about, what concerns them, what they're most fearful of, and what they base those concerns or fears on, so that you can hopefully address those issues or questions they may have.
I was thinking of a situation that I've had in the past where the patient or client did not want to accept any further treatment, and the family were quite upset about that. How would you provide support in that situation? When there's a challenging decision or something to make?
Well, I think you become often the sort of mediator or arbitrator. I think it's important to try to understand, why the person feels that way. Because, and I can speak mostly about the situation in Ontario. Under legislation here, you have the right, to refuse treatment. Whatever your medical condition, whatever the prognosis might be. Part of the assessment of the family is to find out whether the family has been accustomed to sort of family decision-making as a natural process, or whether individual autonomy is something that is valued above family decision-making. It's all part of trying to understand where they're coming from and why they think the way that they do, and it's an opportunity to sort of, validate their concerns or put to rest any misconceptions they have, because often there's an underlying issue as to why they may feel they don't want to sort of, take certain medications, or they wish to seek treatment. And there may be some counseling that may be of value to the patient. And then it's communicating that to the family in terms of, where they're coming from. It's very difficult sometimes in a situation, and I don't honestly know that there's a ready solution to it, where sometimes a family member will... Well, let me back up a little. I'd like to cite a particular example that I know of very recently, where there are 5 adult children, they're all over 50, and their mother died of cancer 10 years ago, and they are still very angry about it. Because at the time when the mother was diagnosed, she chose not to share very much in the way of information. And as the disease progressed and her situation, her condition worsened, she still did not choose to share. One can only assume that she was trying to protect the family. And we know that no one took time to talk with her to discuss what the consequences might be for the family by withholding information, or why a certain attitude or idea or decision may have impact on the family. And to this day, the family is very angry because they were not given the opportunity to care for their mother the way that their mother had cared for them in their growing years. So I think ethically and morally we have a responsibility to help people, in reaching decisions so that they're being reached for the right decision for the right reason, and then communicating that with the family to help get their understanding. Because it can be incredibly stressful if somebody who does not want DNR, for example, that the family is challenging the care team, at that point when DNR might, in other circumstances, be applied.
You've mentioned a couple of times when you assess the family. Can you give me some examples of the type of information you gather when you assess the family?
I think a lot of it is observational in terms of how they communicate, how they behave when you're dealing with certain questions. It's almost as if the palliative care provider needs to be a family therapist in terms of being able to assess how people are responding and reacting to certain situations or responding to certain questions. It's an acceptance, as every family member has to accept, that everyone, has a different point of view based on their own life experience, their own knowledge, etc., and handle situations differently. Not everyone grieves the same way. We know that. And what the family is going through can sometimes compound the challenges that you face in patient care. And it's part of trying to understand, going back to my earlier point, where are they coming from, why they think the way they do about a particular situation, and assessing what their attitude is towards the patient. If we don't all come from the Brady Bunch, the Waltons.
Oh, definitely not.
and sometimes the challenges are immense. If it's a closed family where the communication is not good, and never has been, that we're trying to sort of repair a damaged situation, and sometimes under extreme time considerations. So it's part of trying to assess the behavior and attitudes and try to work with the individual in understanding where they're coming from, and trying to rationalize and explain and help them understand where they're coming from. And it may mean involving additional counsel, though never use that word.
No way.
We found, I did a study recently for Health Canada, and one of the things that came out was language is a really sensitive issue. And we have to be, very careful, though, not only not to use medical jargon, but not to use sort of generalities, like you might benefit from, counsel, for example. The word counsel is a red rag to a bull, and sometimes we're learning a whole bunch of new language skills with people to avoid those kind of triggers that will cause a negative response from somebody.
I know that when you're saying that not everyone's a Brady Bunch, and it's also that just because somebody is dying doesn't mean that people are going to be, change or be friendly or do anything any different than they normally do within the family situation. So if they fight within the family situation before the illness, they're certainly going to do that now as well.
I think it's important, and this is, I guess, early on, this is for them to appreciate what palliative care is going to offer, not just for the patient, but for the family also. Because people may not fully understand when they say, well, we have a palliative care nurse coming in, or we have a palliative care physician coming in. It's not only a new experience for many, but just the whole concept of palliative care, of course, is something still relatively new for many people.
So how do you manage conflict in family?
It's important to make the point for anyone on the palliative care team is they don't have to handle conflict alone. And that, it's something to either involve another colleague in terms of either providing support or even to take a lead position. One of the things that the family looks to is that you, as the professional, one is the source of information, and the expectation is very high that you have answers to the questions, and it's critically important to demonstrate confidence and compassion. Now, that might almost sound redundant. Anyone in palliative care is in palliative care because those are two of the most important qualities that they have. And it's trying to sort of avoid, for example, going from being empathetic to being sympathetic. I use as a kind of an analogy is in describing the difference that when there's someone standing in a puddle, when you're empathetic, you just reach out a hand to help them. When you're sympathetic, you jump in the puddle with them. And it's keeping that sort of objective but compassionate distance from the situation and be seen to be doing so. And I think you have to be something of a crusader or a missionary in trying to help family members understand that as well as they think they may know each other, if this is the first real experience with dying and death, that they will each handle it differently. And that it's very important, to acknowledge and respect the different points of view that everyone will have around the situation. And it's important for the family to understand that they will all cope differently in their own way around the illness, and as death approaches, they will begin to deal with grief themselves, and that they must be allowed to do so. You're almost doing a kind of a sermon to make them realize individually and collectively that they will all have strengths and weaknesses, they will all have different emotions around the issue, they will all handle things differently, and that the primary concern is the comfort and minimizing the suffering of the patient, and they have a part to play in that. I think you need to be constantly alert to look for the things that clearly are upsetting and that might trigger a reaction or argument. So you become, that arbitrator, that mediator in discussions. When there's an expression of doubt or anxiety, you must avoid the tendency to band-aid, even in the interests of diffusing a difficult situation. If someone expresses the concern that the palliative patient is not doing well, don't leap to reassure them that they're doing fine. This can be very stressful for all concerned in the long run. When someone openly expresses concern, they're really testing the listener's receptivity to discussion. The most appropriate response really is to try and sort of identify the emotion or the sentiment that's being expressed and reflect back on it, to them in terms of why they think the way that they do. One of the greatest gifts that we have is the quality of the attention that we give to the palliative patient. And a lot of the time you're dealing with fear and anger and a sense of a loss of control. And I think a lot of conflict can be avoided early on in those some of the things that we talked about earlier in this discussion, in helping them understand what is happening, what is likely to happen, how things might progress, the role that they play. I think if you engage the family that early on in that way, then that minimizes, it doesn't eliminate, but it minimizes the potential for conflict.
I've been just taking in what you've been saying, and it gives, I think it even gives the listeners a better understanding of families and how to remember that families do cope. You know, each individual does cope differently, does think differently, has a different perspective. I think you sometimes forget that when you go in to do the work.
I think, too, in that early discussion with the family, you can let them know that you're sensitive to the fact there's going to be some difficult times. There'll be times when they feel more anger or more frustration. There'll be times when they want to close up and not communicate. There'll be times when they will feel they want to just burst out with whatever emotions. And these are all very natural, expressions. So to me, you manage conflict by reducing the potential. And that happens much earlier on. If we go back to some of the questions you asked early on in that sort of initial, setting of the stage, if you like, you'll always be dealing with emotions, and it will be a constant roller coaster. But I think real conflict can be avoided with that early preliminary discussion and planning and involvement of the family.
Yeah, and I always think that when working with families, that people are going through it different ways. So there usually is some anger and bargaining and denial, but everybody doesn't do it in the same order, and they're not at the same spot, and they go back and forth. And so I always think of that as well.
There isn't really a set pattern to how people deal with issues. I mean, even if you look back in your own regular, healthy life, whenever there's a crisis, whether it be around, finances or whatever, everyone handles it differently. And I think you can help alert people ahead of time, knowing that death is approaching, that the situation is going to become more and more challenging emotionally. There's an assumption by families that as a palliative care provider, you've been there, you've done that, and there's a certain expectation that that you know what to expect. We can't anticipate everything, but I think there's an awful lot that can be done in that sort of first stage or first steps of learning about the family and them about you and about palliative care and etc. There's a tremendous amount too. I remember Linda Christensen, who used to be in Winnipeg, mentioned one of her patients said, "Comfort my father and you comfort me." And that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from when they see their father or the mother, whoever the patient is suffering. Then it just triggers all the other emotions and anger and everything else. So providing good, solid palliative care to the patient is going to alleviate a lot of problems, a lot of issues. When the family can see what good is being done, we know that palliative care can make an impact very, very quickly, even in the most difficult situations. And that's visible evidence to the family, that things are better than they were, and they know that the patient is in some comfort, is not suffering pain. And this sort of helps to some degree to sort of, avoid some of these other clashes and conflicts that occur. I think it's very, very important to provide family with concrete information. The most important element of communication in the palliative setting is being both honest and specific. But I think it's also equally important for the family to understand, and this has to be made clear to them, is that care providers can only give, educated guesses, and surprises do happen. In the end, whatever happens may not be under the control of either the palliative patient or the care provider.
Hi, we were wondering, you talked about the California daughter syndrome, when the family from outside parachutes in the middle of the situation. How do you handle them?
I think it's important to sort of meet with them separately to find out what they know and don't know, and hopefully give them some important information, obviously, that will get them to climb down, off their high horse. It goes back to, again, if they haven't been part of some of the early discussions and dialogue with the family, then you need to play some catch up. And I think that when you assess the family at the beginning, and hopefully you can find out then, if there are any sons or daughters who do not live locally, and when they visit, to sort of make the offer to be available to meet with them. So that gives you the opportunity to bring them up to speed in terms of what has happened, what is happening. And I think when it comes from the care provider, the professional care provider, it might diffuse, the potential for conflict. If there's a strained relationship between the family that lives, closer to the parents and the person that's visiting from the West Coast or the East Coast or whatever, then that might be diffused if it's possible to engage somebody from the palliative care team to talk to them directly. That's the opportunity then to kind of, bring them up to the same, hopefully a similar level of understanding about what's going on, and then to field their questions. I think sometimes when families are left to deal with someone parachuting in or the California daughter, we're not supporting the family as much as we might be able to. Now, there could be some challenges to that, some simple logistics that make that difficult. But I think the family needs to know that any time they want to meet with someone from the palliative care team, for example, if a visiting brother or sister is in town, that you're there to do that they shouldn't have to shoulder that responsibility all by themselves. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
It's more of a comment, I guess, than a question, but it struck me when you said the quote, "Comfort my father and you comfort me," and just the many ways that palliative care is woven together with symptom management and emotional comforting and all those kinds of things, and how big the job is in some ways, that there's so many different ways to comfort, and how they all need to be examined and paid attention to.
Most definitely, because it's like a ripple effect. If they see that the patient's pain is not being dealt with, or there's some particularly uncomfortable symptoms or side effects to medication they're taking, or there may be some emotional issues or spiritual issues. If these things aren't being addressed, then it has a ripple effect. It reverberates right through the family. So really, one of the keys to good relationships with the family is being really on top of things with the patient. When they see the patient is being comforted and supported, that has a powerful effect on influencing the entire family. It's when they see something, they see stress, when they see anxiety, that then they react, because sometimes they're helpless, they don't feel in control, and there's often a knee-jerk reaction to this. So, really, illness does reverberate right through the family, so it follows that, the first requirement is good palliative care for the patient. That will be a powerful influence on the relationship that you have with the family.
Barry, I want to make a comment as well. When you talk about values history, I think that's a very important component, to initiating dialogue with family members. But more than that, I wanted to add that in home care, in the palliative care home care setting, we do sort of an assessment that applies to all home care people using a functional assessment tool. And I almost feel as though it could be broadened to include things such as this values history. It's something that, especially with the fragmentation of care, when you've got a lot of, casual people taking care of clients, it's really important to know where the family's at and why they're thinking the way they do. I think it often gets brushed over until there's a crisis, and I just really wanted to make that point, that I really do like this idea, and I almost feel it should be incorporated into an initial assessment. How do you feel about that?
I agree wholeheartedly, because quite often, palliative care teams do find themselves in a crisis situation. There's certain expectations, for example, and we're trying to sort of be realistic at all times. We need to understand where the family is coming from in this regard. And there may be a certain expectation of the healthcare system or social services system that just is totally unrealistic. And it does help to understand why, there's an expectation that there will be a physician who will make house calls, or there will be round-the-clock nursing available. Some of those very practical things need to be thought about and discussed so we know where they're coming from, so they're realistic about their expectations. But it goes much deeper than that, though, in terms of their faith. Well, that's a part of their value system, and we need to understand that. And, of course, as we discussed very briefly earlier, in some families there can be differences. There may be some members of the family who are deeply religious and others not, for whatever reason. It's important to know that.
Yes, and I think, like you said, validating misconceptions, I mean, that can cut off a lot of future problems if you can do that early.
Yeah.
So thanks so much.
I had a family situation. My mother passed away last year in October. She was 80 and she was in ICU. And we had a few family meetings, and together we agreed that there was nothing else that could be done and she could be taken off life support. So my question is, I just want to know if this happens often, or if what happened to us, if there's something we could do about maybe reporting it or making suggestions or something. So anyways, we agreed, and so they gradually lowered the ventilator and lowered the blood pressure medication. And we thought that she'd have a few more hours. And then walked in a fellow who was adjusting the ventilator, and then he took it off like that, and he said, "Doctor's orders." And within a few minutes, she was gone. And we were in shock because we were expecting that it would be a gradual process. So I'm wondering if this kind of thing happens often, or if maybe we need to talk about what happened to the hospital staff.
It does happen, or appears to happen a lot, but I think it comes back to really understanding what the implications are or what the options are in any decisions that are made. And this is not exclusive to palliative care. But I think one of the issues that we see a lot of, and this showed in the study that I did for Health Canada earlier this year, is that the system fails us. That even if you've had this discussion with the physician, that it may not necessarily find its way into the system. And not everyone, is as understanding or as supportive or as sympathetic. So it's a philosophical question that if you're providing care and support for someone, particularly someone who's terminally ill, that whether you're the technician or the physician or the nurse or the chaplain, you're all part of that care team. So to me, it sounds like in that situation, it was kind of an attitude. I mean, the person that came in and switched everything off was just, well, this is patient number 2750, and I'll move on to the next one next. So that's part of the, if you like, the culture of that organization.
Okay.
That we need to work at that. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in palliative care as well. Within the palliative care team, there is a definite culture. But that culture needs to sort of be extended, to the hospital, to the clinic, to the long-term care facility, wherever. It has to be part of that thinking. So there's that sensitivity, that compassion that prevails under all circumstances.
I'd like to know how to deal with situations that happen sometimes when you get a patient either on a floor, palliative oncology, and the family comes up to you and says, don't tell him like where he is, or we don't want them to know that they have cancer or they have so much time left, because if you do, well, they'll die sooner. They're very determined that we don't say anything to the family. So how do you deal with this situation sometimes with the families?
Ultimately, the decision is the patient's. And if that patient is able to communicate, I think you need to establish how much information they want. Because in some cultures, and when I say culture, I do not necessarily mean ethnic groups. I mean, there are different cultures, and the family has its own culture. How much information do they want? What do they need to know? And you may have to get some kind of input from the family on this. But the situation does come up very regularly, and in some families there's a feeling of protection to withhold, because and it could be legitimate in that to know that somebody has cancer or AIDS may have a very negative effect on their overall morale and spirits. So there may be a perfectly legitimate, reason, but we need to understand that. Quite often, it's a good idea under any circumstances to engage the patient in a discussion about what they know about their disease and their illness. It gives you some very important clues as to how much they want to know. It's also a legitimate question to ask them. Should they be talking to the patient, their substitute decision maker, or their family around decisions on medication, or if there's a change in circumstances or the disease? And that's something, again, A lot of this is hindsight, unfortunately, and we have to start doing this early on at the very beginning, understanding where the family's coming from, so that we can address some of these issues more effectively. I think it's important to understand why the family feels that way and try to find ways to validate that. But I think the first clue comes from the patient in terms of what they already know and what they want to know.
I just wanted to reiterate the take-home message that Barry talked about in the discussion, that success in comforting the palliative patient and supporting his or her family rests almost entirely on the ability to communicate effectively, that it's important to provide families with concrete information. The most important element of communication in the palliative care setting is being both honest and specific, and that it's equally important for the family to understand that care providers can only give educated guesses and surprises do happen. In the end, whatever happens may not be under the control of either the palliative patient or the care provider.
This has been a Pallium Project Professional Development Podcast. For more information on the Pallium Project, including written transcripts of this session, please visit www.pallium.ca. Pallium.